Меня зовут Алексей Вишняков, и сегодня мы будем
Hi, I'm Alexei Vishnikov, and today we are going to talk about rootkits. And this presentation would not have been here without Pavel Maksutin, and he's not presenting today because he is actually, presenting his thesis. Although you would say that, the presentation that's happening right now is much more important than the one he is doing. And he's actually made a great contribution to the study I will be presenting. He has got lots of tools on GitHub, he's got his own blog. So if you do not know Pavel, check him out. And he's actually one of the organizers of Yauza CTF. So he's one of us. Now, I also speak quite often at various conferences, and even more so before COVID. And I'm the head of malware detection department at Positive Technologies. I'm a virus analyst previously. And together with the team, I'm an expert in charge of developing a bunch of tools listed in the previous slide, but we are going to discuss rootkits. So first, we'll go into the subject gently. Maybe we'll crack some jokes even, and then we'll talk about various rootkit-related techniques. We'll see what's bad about them and how they do it. Next, we'll talk about detecting them and how we can help. And then we'll summarize. Some of you may have visited our product webinars, and some of this information, therefore, will not be new. But I promise I won't be repeating myself too much. This is a fragment of the Telegram chat about how it all started. This is how things so often start, We discuss if it ever makes sense, and it does sound attractive, and we do have our doubts. And then, we run this project for several years, and it all started with a short exchange of messages. So what are rootkits? I love Googling definitions. It's always funny enough, isn't it? So, for example, this one says that rootkit is a malicious software that, goes into your computer using different channels. Obviously, we're not going to use this definition. Actually, some people know a lot. There are computer shamans who know stuff. Well, this one says, for example, that, if you delete something incorrectly, it becomes even more aggressive. And, these people say that they can do actually anything, They can treat your computer of all sorts of illnesses. So they are indeed computer shamans. Actually, that's not our case. Now, rootkits, as we understand them, is a software that enables the hacker to escalate privileges to max level on a given system. That's it. Naturally, when you are omnipotent on a system, you can do anything, right? You can launch whatever you like, you can create, you can delete, and you can do so many things and stay unseen. So maximum privilege escalation is the be-all. So we will be talking about rootkits which usually enable it. Let's talk techniques now. These are examples of rootkits, and they're numerous. Naturally, this is not an exhaustive list. And we've done some studies and reports on that. But what does this list suggest? Probably, we don't really need to consult the full list of 70 rootkits or what have you. Well, these are actually some of the recent rootkits dating back to 2021 and 2018. So this is effectively the basis for my speech today, and we are going to show elements of their code. I guess you know the full list of online analyzers. There is, for example, Modun, which is a Chinese analyzer. So we found one funny sample of it once, and we actually wanted to, learn more about it because we want to help our people our friends who were doing a network detection. So we gave this task to one of our interns. And he dived deep into it for like 6 months. He analyzed thousands of files,
так называемое, но не
I
уверен.
understand it was a variation of Apple Fox, though I'm not entirely sure.
Сложно. И, кстати, есть статья на Хабре.
So finding this stuff is not that difficult, and there is an article on Hubber. He actually published it, in his own name. And lots of interesting technical information there. And he does cover lots and lots of techniques there. And he packaged it all very nicely and very concisely into a single article. So now let's talk code. What is it that we don't really want full privilege software to do? We certainly don't want them to identify that a new process is launched and react to that. So there are, notifications and callbacks that do that. So something like this I'm showing here right now, be a set create process notify routine. Well, for example, if we do this, for example, we can kill a process, right? And this is core code.
Запомнили, да? Регистрируем нотификации на новый процесс в системе. Дальше.
So this is how it does registration of new process notifications. So the same notifications, the same callbacks, but in a stream, right? We will learn about a new stream, and then we shall be able to react to that. For example, we can kill the stream. This is what it can look like. And these are fragments of code from the rootkits I mentioned previously. Callbacks and notifications, but this time on loading executables. So DLLs and libraries are being loaded. And again, we'll learn about that. Now, you may think that just like process start, it can be used for exfiltration. No. It may be useful to some people to know that. So these were processes, but also there is registry, right? So there is a function that will register callbacks in the registry. And there is getCell routine. Actually, it's not exported as a symbol on all operating system versions, but you can find it with a signature search. And then, with one of the rootkits, it can be hijacked. So I'm showing here the list of processes that are being checked. So if we have a system or a services process, then everything will go to it. But if it's a regedit, then there will be a swap. There will be a substitution. So in the UI, the user will not be able to see certain elements of the registry. So I've mentioned notifications and callbacks, and the list of callbacks is something that we believe needs to be very carefully monitored, because, they are being used a lot by rootkits. And I'm showing here how list of callbacks is being searched for, for further substitution of addresses. So we've registered a callback. And then, we can find the list of objects related to it and parse it, and then, replace and substitute. It doesn't have the API here, which is important. If there is no API, identifying it, in an automated way in your system is very difficult. API is often a telltale sign, but you don't need an API for that. So process and registries, this is file system now. Indeed, we can do registration of mini filter driver, and this should help you hijack operations in the file system. And, this is the specific syntax in different rootkits. This unusual function is not seen as often. I register as registration change. So if there is a new file system appearing, or at least, a new driver being uploaded for file systems, for the drive, not for a USB stick, it can actually be noticed, and then you can go into the device object stack, and then you can intercept all the messages going there. So this way, we do not get hooked to a particular drive. You can do the same actually for USB sticks, and manipulate data there or hide data there. Now let's talk traffic. Naturally, we can do data injection in the TCP stream, and there is a special function for that. So this this is what it will look like.
Вообще, на самом деле, целый SDK у Microsoft.
Oh, there is, in fact, an SDK. Microsoft calls it a Windows filtering platform, which enables so many traffic manipulations, which is good and bad at the same time. It is good because it is easy to identify, when specific functions are called. These callbacks.
Но суть та же, это тоже списки
They are called not callbacks but callouts in WFP, but the idea is the same. So if you intercept a function, or if you see a function being intercepted, that shows that somebody is, having fun with your system. But again, the problem is that it's legit, which means that, some good software designed to protect your information and defend it may be using it. So it's not really 100% kind of alert timber. We'll come back to this discussion later.
Как я уже сказал, здесь тоже есть callouts, соответственно, можно доходить до этих.
There are callouts here as well, so you can go to those objects in the callout list, and you can actually substitute them.
Непосредственно работать с айтемами, да, с данными.
So this is how you can actually work with data, with items, rather than using APIs.
Более, наверное, да, эксклюзивные варианты.
And there are naturally more advanced cases for rootkits. How about this? You can see that a new driver is being uploaded, and then you can find its entry point. And in the entry point, you can write several bytes. I'm showing this in the green section. So this is effectively an upload of driver with information that something is going wrong. I think this is an elegant way of pulling down a driver already being uploaded. And then, it's automatically being offloaded. And then it tells the system that, something has been, has gone wrong, but you're not, obviously killing it. More about techniques. We've been talking a lot about functions, and these are symbols you can find, and you can hook them, and you can monitor them. Malware can actually obtain addresses from symbols or by symbols, and you can also find them with signature search. And then you can implement them, fragments of function prologues, and you can start execution in the middle, for example. For instance, let's take a write a virtual memory offset function. You can skip the beginning, and then hand it over, and this will really dupe a lot of defense systems, because many of them will only be monitoring the start of functions. And rootkits often use this. Now, also we have services, right? And it's very popular. Architecturally, they are very similar to processes. In the core, there is structure and process, but for services in user mode, there is an entity called service record. You can also find it in user mode from the core and substitute things there, like remove an entry, and thus conceal the service from the list of services. So this can also be done. Well, the driver will need to map stuff and edit stuff in the memory. And I'm showing the signature here, showing how they will be looking for service records for different operation systems. The driver itself has lots of interesting things. For example, they will be major functions, and rootkits are trying to abuse them as well. So they will do intercepts and substitutions. So when a command is sent to a driver through a major function, it will go through, an API handler. It will be substituted. And there is a more elegant way of making the driver do something it shouldn't be doing. We can actually look for code sections in it that still have some element in them. Well, you all know that executable files have got this leveling, and there will be empty space there filled with zeros. So you can actually write there, and then you can do pointer substitution there so that, it points to a new function. It's very neat, isn't it? Say, when PageGuard will actually check for integrity, it will see that, okay, it's pointing to address space of the driver, which is okay. There is nothing weird about it. And if we actually install a pointer to our own driver in some other address space, PageGuard will probably see it. And in fact, your malicious code will be able to be executed inside the address code, the address space of the driver itself. And it's possible because there are so many vulnerable drivers, which enable us to actually upload arbitrary malicious code in the core. I'm listing only 3 utilities here, but naturally there are so many vulnerable drivers. Naturally, we are not going to list them here. That would be a stupid thing to do. And if you haven't seen it, there is this grouping called, there is a group called ISMO, and they are talking a lot about specific techniques which are good for specific vulnerable drivers. And we will be checking it, when we are fine-tuning our defenses. Well, because, we want to test them for penetration. That's why we will be using the malicious code. And this malicious code is easily available off GitHub. We've been talking a lot about various techniques. And it has been fast. Now let's talk about detection methods. Let's see how they work. Well, those who have attended our webinars must have been expecting this slide. Here, it effectively enables us to do so many more, so much more. So the Drackwolf system does support lots of things because the Drackwolf enables us to analyze the state of the operating system, even when we don't have analyzers inside the virtual system. We've been talking a lot about when we talked about malware detection. For rootkit detection, we certainly wouldn't want to be next to it in the core, where by definition we won't have higher privileges, because you certainly know that in the core all drivers are created equal. It's effectively a race thing, like who's smarter. So if the rootkit gets not privilege but precedence, it will win. And yes, there is a certain loading sequence which you can check on MSD page of Microsoft. So all drivers are created equal. That's why we need precedence. We certainly don't want to be sitting next to rootkit and therefore standing a chance of being duped. That's why, Drackwolf is on hypervisor level. Moreover, it's a modular system and it's open source. It's a technical track. We're not really advertising the product here. We are talking about things that, or tools that can be used by anybody interested. So why does it work like this? Why don't we need an agent? You need to read the bottom part of this table. Now, this is the physical memory of the guest, and this is the physical memory of the host. So there won't be this direct transfer here. You will have to make the full circle journey here. So there will be an additional segment of memory that will be used for address translation. So if you need to actually detect it, you will be doing it in the intermediary layer between the physical layer where the hypervisor is running and the VM layer where all the bad things are happening. You don't need to wrap your mind around it right now. Maybe you don't even need it. But the general concept is that between the two physical elements of memory, there is an intermediary layer which actually sees everything that's happening in the guest. And all the memory of the virtual machine is therefore transparent. This is why we can do intercepts. This is we can do checks and monitoring. So this is the typical environment of a debugger. However, it exists on the hypervisor level. So the modular architecture of Dracwolf, and you see all the plugins here, all the network functionalities there. We will discuss the structure of Dracwolf in more detail tomorrow. What's important to understand now is that if you want to add more functionality, something that's missing in it, you need to come up with a new plugin. And it's easy to implement them. You don't really need to drill deep into it or have, great conceptual understanding of it. So as part of this research, we've developed new plugins. I'm referring to callbackmon and rootkitmon. And before us, two other plugins were there, dcom and sdtmon. And we also edited these plugins, thus giving ourselves this set of plugins that you can call a rootkit detection technology inside Dracwolf. Why not a single plugin? We used to have one. But in the course of development, we ran into all sorts of issues we couldn't really predict before, and thus we have 4 plugins. Not convenient, but this is how it works. We can actually explain why they're like this. I will follow now with very complicated slides, but I guess they are the most important ones. They actually explain why I wanted to show this stuff to you. I actually want to show, the full functionality, so to speak, of this tool. So this is what we have after numerous experiments. I'm showing here what it was like last summer. And this is the stuff that rootkits are not really doing anymore because PatchGuard is there. But, to be on the safe side, we had to provide for this as well, such as, protecting against system call table modifications, an interrupt table, and hull table, and so on. NSR and LS star registers, item 10. So this is about, the pointer of the processor of syscalls. So it's effectively a part of the core which decides which part of SDT to call. This is what MSR register talks about. All these techniques have been known for a long time, but it was hygienic for us to cover it. So we have perfect protection for all this. This is the stuff we promised last summer, and it wasn't available back then. It is available now. I should probably cover every item on this list because it's interesting. So item 11 is about the pages, or rather, sections of drivers, which are marked as executable, but not patched. They cannot be swapped into page file if you're out of memory. So these sections are now protected, which means that the technique I previously discussed will not be able to write a segment of code into it. Same is actually true for headers. So, previously there would be, a certain interrupt handler, not any, this vector is prohibited now. Next one, the stack one. So every participant of the processing queue can actually attack the stack. And now we are protecting this. We've talked about objects such as major functions, and also init, unload, and start EU drivers, but there is also fast IO handlers. So all these pointers, they are controlled for integrity, and also process lists and service lists, and what's the most important, list of drivers. So all these lists are now monitored. So before we go to the callback list, so we also have the WFP subscription list and lots of other callback structures, and it can take us a long time to discuss it. So, for example, there are these callbacks, Win32p callouts. So you can guess by their name what they're responsible for. The point is that there are many lists like this, and a hacker can actually try modifying any of them. And then something can be triggered from user mode, and he will stay hidden. There won't be any APIs triggered, for example. So we are protecting all this now. Listed on the left in white now are the functions that came from the previous section of the presentation about Rootkit techniques, such as library uploads and so on and so forth. So all these APIs a link to the registry and new file system registration. We are not intercepting them, but we are intercepting the callbacks and the callouts they're leveraging. So, if you want to make your great contribution to Twitter, you can select any function. It has not been selected before and deploy it on your own. And you can call it PageGuard bypass, and the community will lap it up. That's what we did. For example, this function for creation of a subscription for registration of new processes. We implemented this function, and effectively, in the core, we did a separate implementation of this function so that we could do callbacks. So modification like this can be done, therefore it needs to be controlled. So this is something that people are calling PageGuard bypass now. But in essence, you can take any function of kernel 32, like add file or whatever, you implement it separately, and instead of calling kernel 32, you can do any arbitrary function. So this is how many bypasses are done. Note that it's happening at the core level now. So there were these lists previously showing what this tool is capable of. Let me show some fragments of the code so that it's easier for you to wrap your mind around it. So I'm showing here how you can actually get those addresses of the symbols.
В некоторых случаях для Darkwolf потребуется сделать так называемое профилирование.
In some cases, you will need to do profiling for Darkwolf, because by default, it can find symbols for NTLS kernel and Win32k for the native graphic system. But for anything related to traffic, there won't be any symbols there, so it will be difficult for you to use other elements of the code. So you will need to substitute your own profiles so that these symbols are detectable. So I'm showing here that how we are actually saving this list as vectors. So we're writing all these addresses as vectors, all the addresses we can do, and then we check them, and we will compare them one-on-one. Or alternatively, we can write them one after the other and compare strings, or we can compare their hashes. But this is how we did it. Next, we are going to discuss triggers. When is it best to do it? Because it does, relate to everything I've been talking about and when you would like to make these comparisons. Now let's talk about control of the drivers you uploaded. So you probably know that you can upload them bypassing the ledger tools. And this way, information on uploaded drivers will be missing from the log. So there is a function called miProcessHolder entrant, which will be called every time drivers are uploaded or offloaded, and it's seated very deep inside the core, inside the kernel. So here we're able to see what's coming and what's going out of the system, and then we can get the full list of drivers. I don't remember how they call it in the kernel. PSP enum something. I don't remember the name of the function though. But the idea is that this function is going to show to you what users should be able to see if they request those lists. And then we can actually compare what the system is going to show to what we are seeing. And if we are seeing a difference, it means somebody has uploaded or offloaded a driver in an illegitimate way.
На самом первом слайде про то, что метод
What I
утилиты,
had in my
да,
first
этот
slides,
про
my
то, что
first
сейчас
slide
rootkit
about
уже
this
не делают, вот,
utility,
тем не менее,
this
как
is
все
something that
выглядит.
rootkits are
Адресы
no longer
указателей
doing.
на interrupt table, на
So
descriptor
these are
table,
addresses of pointers to the
значение
script
регистра
IA
абстракт,
table and
все это
interrupt table,
собирается, соответственно,
including
процессы,
the values of the
они
registers. All this
проходят,
stuff is collected.
кэшируются
And
целиком
these
полностью
tables,
сразу, а
they're all
потом
parsed, they're
спустя
all
какое-то
hashed.
время происходит
And
сравнение
then after
адресов
some
попарно,
time,
ну, либо хэшей. Вот,
addresses
если что-то
are
не совпадает,
compared
значит алертим.
one on
Там
one,
снизу, кстати,
or
вот в
they
PNP,
hashes. And if
не
something
знаю,
is,
обращаете ли внимание на это или нет, этот
mismatched, we will
принцип
need to
указывается в
reverse
таком
it.
случае, чтобы,
And I'm
например,
showing the
в
prints
разных
here as well,
ситуациях будет, на
which
разных
is
случаях
also
ситуации, а не
useful.
просто, что есть абстрактный
So
объект.
in different
А
situations,
дальше
you will
в итоге
be given
девайсов
different
это такая
prompts.
цепочка обработчиков, помните, да, я
Device
рассказывал, через
stacks.
которую проходят все пакетики, которые нужно обработать драйверам,
So
чтобы
this is effectively a
файлик
chain,
потом в
as
конце
I
концов
previously said,
пользователю отдать какой-нибудь.
that
Путем доступа к этому
lists
чейну
all the functions that
запоминаем
need to
все
be
девайсы,
initiated in
храним их.
order for,
Дальше
say, a
мы
user
идем
to get
в
their
так
file.
называемую директорию объектов, Object Directory
So if
называется.
we go
У нее
to the
создается
object
веселая интересная
directory,
архитектура про то, что там есть 37
it
хэш-бакетов,
actually
если
has
их можно обходить, не
its
очевидно. Там
own
проверяются
architecture,
объекты,
37
называется
hash
драйвер,
buckets,
то,
which
что нам
can
нужно. Таким
be
образом, мы можем все объекты
um,
драйверов в системе
which
собрать
can
за один
actually be
проход. Там
traversed.
же есть история про то, как Microsoft
And
решили,
also,
что можно с 10-й версии
Microsoft, I
взять
should
и
remind you,
ксорить
starting from Windows 10,
идентификатор
decided they could
из
XOR
структуры
identifiers from the
объекта,
structure
который нас
here,
ведет к
from the
альфа-нему
object
и
structure,
к имени
that
этого
will
object
take
name,
us the
они
object
просто
name
стали там
and the name here. So they,
математической формулой как-то ксорить, двигать побайтово, и
they started, shifting it byte by byte. They started XORing it, and it sounded like they made it less simplistic. And we are also doing it now in order to get all this data. To me, it sounds like a pretty weird way of defense. It doesn't work in any case, but what matters is that you can parse it all, right? Or traverse it all. So what can be done? You can hash the addresses of major functions, particularly driver ini and driver app unloads, and the other handlers can also be hashed. And then at some point in time, you can check these hashes for discrepancies, and then in the chain of device objects, you can do the same. So if something is wrong, if the number of items is different, or if the sequence is different, then it means that somebody has been having fun with your system. How they did it is a separate concern. Well, this one is a driver section. So we have this section here with characteristics like non-pageable and executable and non-write. Indeed, it would be weird to hash a section whose content changes often. So hashes are calculated for all the drivers, in all the sections. No, I'm not showing this comparison slides. Before we turn to takeaways, let's stress something important. When would you want to do all this stuff? Naturally, we did it all for a particular product. Not because we had a lot of time to waste. So we decided the best thing to do was to sort of, enumerate and calculate everything I listed in the beginning of my presentation when talking about the sandbox, and then, make this comparison again, make this calculation at the very end. So if we did only twice, it will not impact the performance. But on the other hand, nobody stops a rootkit from, substituting things, doing things, and then, keep it hush-hush and bring the system back to its initial state. Then we won't really see it. So how do we add new triggers? I guess I'm sorry, let me put it differently. We probably need to use time-based triggers. PageGuard actually does it, at random periods of time. I'm not sure this is the best way performance-wise to do it. We'll be thinking about alternatives. But you guys can actually use Dracmove, and you can run those comparisons much more often if your conditions provide for that. If performance is not much of a concern to you, or if you're doing it in a lab.
Много ситуаций, когда
and there are numerous situations
воспользоваться частым триггером. Например, регистр CR3.
Where you would want to do it often. Like there is a registry which is very often changed. Like context in this registry will change every time you enter the kernel. So
соответственно, триггер сообщения того, что CR3-регистр поменял свое значение.
You can establish a trigger for any CR3 change, and you can run your checks every time it happens. And then you will do it like 15 or 20,000 times per minute, maybe even more. Lots of checks. And as a trigger-based monitoring, it should work. Or you can do it with regard to modifications of memory areas, or you can link it to APIs, or you can do it like with syscalls. There can be so many different triggers. I think it's only your imagination that will limit you. And this may easily dumbfound a hacker. And I'm showing here the simplest example, something that we have in the production version. My takeaways. Why have I told you all this? I wanted to show that rootkits are in fact more complicated than the internet would suggest. I've tried to show how complicated it can be. So rootkit is not just about persisting in the kernel, but also about not being noticed by PageGuard and not attracting any attention if, for example, if you're screwing the kernel.
Есть отличная история про технологию EPT.
Which puts me in mind of
Есть своя технология про вот эти теневые таблицы.
EPT and AMD has got something similar. They've got a shadow tables which enable tracking access to the operating system memory if it is virtual, and we have a hypervisor, and you can analyze it all. This way, we won't be able in the same environment with the malware. It's important. Rootkit effectively will be able to do anything on the system. It will be able to conceal itself in full, unless we are one level closer. And we are an important contributor to the DruckWolf project. Please check out what we've got on GitHub. We recently updated the master folder. So everything I've been telling you about in this page is already available there. And please join us. Let's research it together and let's continue developing DruckWolf. There are so many tasks there. I know there will be questions about Linux. You can already guess my answer. I'm done. Thank you.
Так, увидел руку здесь, да, пожалуйста, микрофон.
Да, спасибо большое за доклад. Вот вы сказали то, что мы не находимся в одной среде.
You have mentioned the importance of not being in the same environment with the rootkit. But then for some rootkits, being in a virtualized environment may scare some rootkits off.
Два пункта в ответе. Первый пункт.
Two answers. All vendors have been finding and looking for ways to make their virtual environment sort of invisible.
Там, не знаю, инструкциям CPU ID, то, что возвращается информация там, да.
Could be, say, CPU ID instructions or other ways of establishing whether it's virtual or not. But most importantly, you have DruckWolf. If Rootkit tries doing something, in order to check if it's in a virtual machine or not, well, then you can register it and respond. I think we will have a report on that later. We are going to talk about bypassing VM checks done via requests to VMI. We've written a bunch of code on how you can actually substitute those responses. You can do it at the hypervisor level. In fact, so many machines are virtualized, and a lot of infrastructure is running on VMs. It's not just mail servers. Very often domain controllers are running on virtualized infrastructure, which means that, VMs will not necessarily scare a hacker off, particularly if they learn that, this virtual machine is juicy, is sexy, not just, some stupid user machine. But then, you need to provide proper hardening and protection.
Добрый день, спасибо за доклад. Расскажите, пожалуйста,
Hi, thank
с
you.
точки зрения коммерческого использования, как сильно данное решение понижает...
Commercially speaking, how much will this system damage performance of the system? If we're talking about rootkit detection, the impact is negligible because we're only talking about two actions. Prior to analysis starts, you can calculate just a couple of bytes and then you do hash. It could be MD or SHA hash, MD5. I'm sorry. Much more will need to be done differently. Like if you're checking syscalls, for example, or memory access. So there will be a short delay, while Darkwolf and hypervisor execute their code chunks, so that the VM continues working. It will take some microseconds. That will have more of an impact. So if we're talking about your ability to use a Darkwolf for identifying rootkits, yes, you can do it without impacting the performance. Okay, what if we need to sit it on a permanent traffic or high load traffic? Well, you will still have the same triggers, right? It's your call how often I go in to check for integrity. If you do it very often, like 1,000 times a second, well, naturally, you will feel the performance impact. And if you don't do it as often, you won't. I think you can find a sweet spot. And your ability of finding this sweet spot will really thwart the hacker, really, or not. Now, I guess that, hackers are also listening to this, and hackers will not really know what is the frequency that you chose and how exactly you're defending and hardening your system. Which will make it more difficult for them and more interesting for us.
Спасибо за исследование. Такой вопрос.
Thanks for your research.
Вспомните какие-нибудь сэмплы, которые вы смотрели, и
Can you think of a particular sample that you found interesting? Maybe you discovered some new technique that you hadn't discovered before in reverse engineering. And what are the names of the groups to follow if I am interested in rootkits? If I can have my presentation back.
Можете, пожалуйста, слайд вернуть, презентацию на экран? Господа организаторы, верните презентацию на экран, пожалуйста.
My presentation back, please.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Сейчас долистаем. Это вот то, что было в презентации. То есть вы это увидите, это останется в
So
артефактах.
this is what you are going to find in presentation documents. So this is the top 7 list to check out. And this is the link to the Hubbard.com article, which talks about a very fancy rootkit that our intern identified. And I think that this will cover roughly 50% of things that were new to me. The techniques that were absent from previously known rootkits. And I should also mention the invisible group. 2 more questions. Hello. A simple question and a comment. On modern systems, you have virtual-based security. And having a hypervisor is like a usual requirement. So if you're detecting some sample, it could be VBS, right? So how do you go about it? How do you support, if you do, embedded virtualization? And what do you do about OS changes? Do you have like snapshots with shifts?
Виртуализацию на современных ОС. Мы как раз хотим поработать
So virtualization for modern OSs. Now, we certainly want to do more of that. Our Darkwolf analysis shows that, virtual machines, are much slower. If we do it for endpoints, users will be unhappy for sure. If we stick just to rootkit detection, they won't notice it.
Вторая история про то, как сейчас мы работаем с ВБС.
As to the second question about VBS, we are not really supporting VBS in any particular way. But since you're interested, we should work on that. The third question is about snapshots, right? So we've got snapshots which are, for which we have like total clarity. But if the client wants some customized snapshot, we can do that. And for that snapshot, we can do the same kind of magic so that all symbols are properly supported.
Еще вопрос.
Thank you.
У нас время, да, по-моему, есть. У нас очень много времени. Можно...
We still have a lot of time, don't we?
Видел, там был вопрос. Микрофон надо мне.
Да, с удовольствием. Вопрос очень простой. Вы про Никсы хотели...
The question is simple. You wanted to tell us something about Linux systems? No, I didn't, but I did want to propose. Naturally, we want to develop in this area. So the next step will involve not just some new Windows techniques, but also support for Linux systems. I cannot really give you the exact product roadmap, but things like this are there. And naturally, we will need support. If the community is doing it, it will be faster, it will be more interesting, because this way we should be able to discuss, the most difficult, the most contentious elements of it.
Тогда еще один вопрос, если позволите.
Another question, if I may.
Объектом целевых атак не
So,
становился.
has Dragwolf been targeted already? Well, Dragwolf is a subsystem for a hypervisor, and there is also a libvmi wrapper between them, which simplifies working with the raw data. Can you imagine volatility? Something similar. We have not heard of anybody trying to attack Xen, let alone Dragwolf. However, the more popular it becomes, the higher the probability it will be attacked. So we have plans for that. I mean, we have plans for defending against that.
Поднимайте, пожалуйста, руки, если у кого-то еще есть вопросы. Со сцены вас много, тяжело увидеть всех.
Raise your hands, please.
Здравствуйте.
Вот еще,
Большое спасибо за доклад.
Hi. Thank you very much for your report. Where are you? I understand it's primarily about detection of rootkits. Now, to what extent do Windows techniques surpass Linux techniques in terms of complexity? It's a provocative question, a holy war, a rating question. As many answers as people you ask. Now, we started working with Linux, in particular with Astra. And my impression is that Linux is easier. I mean, easier to detect, and the number of variations is smaller. I mean, techniques are fewer, therefore defense is easier. Source code is helpful because we don't really need to reverse anything. As we were doing VMI reverse engineering, we have seen, lots of, say, Indian knockoffs, and we were really scared.
Использование операционных систем, в частности у нас, да, в
So
стране.
I believe that if this country shifts from Windows to Unix systems,
Вариаций этих интересных техник станет больше, потому что больше будет фокуса.
there will be more interesting techniques like this, because naturally
будут саккумулированы, да, в своих
there will be
исследованиях в эту сторону. И
more attractive for the attackers.
находимся с Windows. Так что я бы прям...
So eventually, it may be as popular as Windows.
Меньше привлекает внимание, поэтому и меньше соответствующих техник можно в публичном пространстве услышать, найти.
So the number of techniques at the moment is more limited because the number of systems is not dominant, but it's changing already.
Спасибо, дождался. А что известно про
Thank you.
рутки на уровне гипервизоров?
What do we know about rootkits at the hypervisor level?
Получается, хостовой машины, да, на уровне хостовой
At the level of the host machine, so to speak.
И нас заразили. Ну, это...
Well, if the host machine has been infected,
что-то другое, как-то что-то, да, новое.
it's not dramatically different from what we already know.
Выход за пространство виртуальной машины на хостовое пространство и
So effectively, the malware has escaped the virtual machine and infected the host machine, it's a well-known case. And yes, there have been studies on how to escape a virtual machine. PWN2own, covers this in a lot of detail, consult Trend Micro, but you don't really see it in the wild that often because it's complicated. Because in order to do that, you need to find a particular target, then you need to collect additional information in order to actually find a good POC, which will be functional when you need it. Too much effort, really, for most cases. That's, too sophisticated. That's a kind of Rube Goldberg way of doing it. And, if you've got Rootkit there already and has done so many things, it's already sitting in the system it needs. So it may want to persist there and stay hidden, for such a particular scenario. You don't really need to escape the virtual machine.
Да, такой вопрос еще. Вы где?
Question.
Нет,
здесь.
Where are you?
У вас на слайде одном был перечисленный список,
In a slide, you listed many well-known functions that can be used by malicious drivers. How do we avoid false positives?
Ну да, вот эти вот слайды, я так понимаю, о них, да, речь? Ну,
Да,
в
да, да.
частности.
You must be talking about this slide, right?
Смотрите, это по умолчанию это сложная история, потому что если по умолчанию представить, что это...
Well, by default, that's complicated, because if we're assuming it's a regular workstation, for example, and we will be analyzing what's happening there for months, there will be lots of false positives.
Извините меня, антивирус поставит это.
Well, because some of these false positives will be related to AV, for example. And, for a system like this, an AV will be looking like a rootkit, right? However, in a sandbox, it's different because time is limited and not everything is happening in the sandbox. In any case, you can sort of take into account what's coming into a sandbox. So with this architectural approach, you won't really see too many things that could become false positives there.
Ложные срабатывания. Мониторинг без слепого реагирования на это.
Monitoring without, blind response is the way to go. In our sandbox, we are not getting any false positives at all.
Они были связаны с race-condition.
I'm sorry, we did have some false positives related to the race condition. Let me tell you about this. There was an interesting race condition there.
Так, это, да, вот здесь. Когда мы хотели фиксировать глубоко факты появления и выгрузки новых драйверов,
now, when we wanted to sort of register emergence of new drivers, we can actually intercept numerous functions, and a top-level function was intercepted, and that brought us into a race condition. So in the operating system, something was loading its driver, and the first symbol in driver registration was called. And in the bottom, there was this function, and there was a lot of code in the middle. And we were not able to do the intercept while the system was loading drivers. And when we checked the state of the land at the end of the loading process, we saw, there was something new there. And it was not a legit. It's just that, we were in this code execution window when, code was being executed, but we still hadn't sort of registered it. We found a way around it. My recommendation is naturally whitelisting. All those who do correlations, who do ACMs, who do, event monitoring, they're all using whitelisting. So this is how you can fix it iteratively. So on a particular infrastructure, it will exponentially reduce the number of false positives. But you're absolutely right. Some actions will be legitimate.
тестируется это все в песочнице, и
So you're saying it's all being tested in a sandbox, and there is a time constraint.
смотрите на
So I understand that, you will only be looking at some time series.
возможно, это недостаток, что если драйвер
Is that a disadvantage? So if the driver is there for a long time,
песочнице, и получается, он не будет помечен как вредоносный.
maybe you won't see it in your test window.
Верно. Ну,
You're right.
здесь ничего не остается, как в дальнейшем придумывать новые
But the only solution is to come up with new triggers for analysis, that is, analyze more often. On the other hand,
ну, пытаться различать, короче, да, более фундаментально легитимное действие от нелегитимного, то есть добавлять каких-то еще событий.
certainly we need to distinguish legit from illegit or non-legit actions.
Не знаю, списков особо доверенных цифровых подписей, и на такие софты не срабатывать. Ну, если мы хотим этому доверять.
For example, maybe some specially signed drivers should not generate positive events and so on. But it's an endless struggle, isn't it? And you won't have an ideal system. It will always be work in progress. So in a system, drivers get loaded and offloaded. Doing this action itself is not malicious. Well, drivers may be. While modifications of driver sections, now this is bad, and there won't be any false positive there. Nobody should be trying to write anything into a section of some driver. Some techniques by default will not produce false positives. I hope I've been able to answer your question.
Последнее, что интересно,
My last one.
используется ли метод, который используется в антивирусах обычных, это вот кредит доверия.
Is the method used in AV systems that is credit of trust used here? Like if a particular driver violates the rules, will that guarantee it more attention?
Сейчас используем ли мы это? Прямо сейчас нет. Прямо сейчас мы просто...
At the moment, it's not part of the solution. Actually, we cannot really do it product-wise. Very often the users of our product simply do not have the resources for that. But it's technically feasible. It can be done quite easily. Sure, you can establish alerts in the system, and Darkwolf will actually, handle that on the fly. And then, in a particular event, it should add them. But it's effectively a resource issue. Because often people have those great improvement ideas, but when we implement a particular product, most of these things go out the window when we realize that the client really doesn't have spare resources for that. You can certainly do it in your own lab. Thank you. Time's up. Thank you very much for your attention and for your questions.